I am Nora, and I am 30 years old. If you had met me a year ago, you'd probably think I was just another quiet woman from a small town, the kind who smiles politely at the grocery store, takes care of her father, and minds her own business. And you'd be right, mostly. I lived a simple life. My world revolved around my dad, who had been sick for years, and the little farmhouse where I grew up. But what you wouldn't see, not at first, was how deep the cracks in my family ran. How money, pride, and jealousy can eat away at blood ties until there's nothing left but bitterness and calculation. My father, Edward, was once a respected businessman. He built a manufacturing company from the ground up, something that started in a rented garage and turned into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. My brother Mark was the golden child, the one everyone believed would take the legacy forward. And he did, in his own ruthless way. He was charming, confident, and incredibly ambitious. People loved him. Dad was proud of him too for a long time. But things changed when Dad's health began to fail. It started subtly. Forgotten appointments, confusion over simple things, fatigue that didn't go away. He was diagnosed with congestive heart failure, and for the next few years, our lives revolved around medication schedules, doctor visits, and endless worry. I moved back home to take care of him. It wasn't even a decision. It just happened naturally. I was the one who stayed by his side when he couldn't sleep, when he needed someone to drive him to the hospital at 3 a.m., when he cried because he knew he was losing control over his body. Mark, on the other hand, was too busy. He'd call once a week, maybe send flowers on holidays. He said it was for Dad's sake, that he was running the business, ensuring Dad's legacy lived on. But deep down, I knew he just didn't want to deal with the messy parts of love, the caregiving, the quiet sacrifice, the smell of medicine in the house. Dad never complained. He still defended Mark, always saying, "Your brother's doing his part in his own way." I wanted to believe that, but there was a bitterness growing inside me. Not hatred exactly, just disappointment. When Dad passed away, the grief hit me in a quiet, hollow way. There were no dramatic tears or breakdowns, just silence. That suffocating kind of silence that wraps around you after you lose the only person who ever made you feel safe. I remember sitting on the porch that night, staring at the empty rocking chair where he used to sit and watch the sunset. The house felt heavier than ever. Mark arrived the next morning, wearing a perfectly tailored black suit, sunglasses even though it was cloudy. He hugged me briefly, said the right words. "I'm so sorry, Nora. You did so much for him." Then he went straight into organizing the funeral, calling people, making arrangements, as if it were another business project. I let him. I was too tired to fight. After the funeral, people came up to me with kind smiles, saying things like, "Your father was proud of you, and you were such a devoted daughter." But I noticed how they all drifted toward Mark. He was the one who looked like success. I was just the daughter in an old cardigan, with tired eyes and hands that still smelled like antiseptic wipes. A week later, we got a call from my father's lawyer. His will had been finalized months before his death, and it was time to read it. I didn't expect much. I knew Dad's main assets were tied to the business, and it only made sense that Mark would inherit it. He'd been running it for years anyway. I assumed maybe I'd get some savings or the house, which by now was falling apart at the edges. But I wasn't prepared for how it actually went. The lawyer's office was in the city, modern, glass walls, the kind of place where even the silence feels expensive. Mark sat next to me, confident and relaxed, checking his phone every few seconds. I sat still, hands folded, heart beating quietly. The lawyer, an older man named Mr. Hayes, greeted us politely and opened a folder. His voice was calm, practiced, like he'd done this 100 times before. "Your father, Edward Thompson, left behind a will outlining the distribution of his assets. As per his wishes, I'll read it verbatim." Mark smirked slightly. He already knew he'd come out on top. Mr. Hayes began reading. "To my son, Mark Thompson, I leave my business holdings, Thompson Manufacturing, along with all its associated assets and shares." Mark leaned back, satisfied. Then Mr. Hayes continued. To my daughter, Nora Thompson. I leave the family farmhouse and all land registered under it. Mark let out a quiet laugh. It wasn't loud, but sharp enough to sting. He turned to me and whispered, Guess you got the old shack. Should have taken better care of him. Maybe you'd have gotten something useful. His words burned, but I said nothing. Mr. Hayes went on with a few smaller details, savings accounts, personal effects, jewelry. Then he closed the folder and looked at us both. That concludes the primary division of assets. Mark stood up immediately. Well, that's that, he said, still smirking. I'll have the legal team transfer the business documents this week. You can keep the house, Nora. I'm sure it'll make a lovely hobby farm or whatever. He started to walk toward the door. But Mr. Hayes cleared his throat. Actually, there's one more thing. Mark stopped. What? The lawyer adjusted his glasses and pulled out a sealed envelope. Your father included a separate letter with specific instructions. It pertains to both of you. He wanted it to be read only after the will was disclosed. Something shifted in the air. Even Mark's smug expression faltered slightly. He walked back to his seat, crossing his arms. Mr. Hayes opened the envelope and began to read. My dear children, he started. If you are hearing this, it means I am gone. I know this will has caused surprise, maybe even anger, but I ask you to listen before you judge. I felt a lump form in my throat. The letter went on. Mark, I gave you the business because I know you have the skill to run it. But know this, I am not blind to your flaws. Money and success have hardened you, and I hope that one day you'll remember that people, not profits, are what truly matter. Mark shifted in his seat, eyes narrowing. Mr. Hayes continued. Nora, my dear girl, I gave you the farmhouse because it holds more value than you may realize. I trust you'll understand why in time. It was the place your mother loved most, and it holds something that I believe will make things right, not just for you, but for our family. The room went completely silent. Then the lawyer added quietly, There's also an attached document regarding the farmhouse. It contains additional information and instructions. He handed me a thick brown envelope. My name was written on it in my father's handwriting. I recognized it immediately. Those careful letters, the way he always made the N a little too tall. Mark rolled his eyes. Dad and his dramatics, he muttered. You can keep your mystery letter, Nora. I have real work to do. He stormed out, leaving me sitting there with the envelope in my hands. I didn't open it right away. Something about it felt heavy, like it contained more than just paper, maybe answers, maybe more questions. That night, I sat in the farmhouse kitchen, the same one where I'd made Dad's soup every evening, and finally opened it. Inside was a set of old documents, a hand-drawn map, and a short note. Nora, it said, you were the one who stayed, who cared, who saw me not as a burden, but as your father. What I've left you is not a reward, but a key. The house holds more than memories. Look carefully, and you'll find what I could never tell Mark. I stared at those words, reading them over and over. A key, what did he mean? The farmhouse creaked softly around me, the wind brushing against the windows. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel old or broken. It felt alive, watching, waiting. That night I barely slept. My father's words echoed in my mind. The house holds more than memories. I didn't know it yet, but that letter was the beginning of everything. The beginning of the truth, and the beginning of my revenge, calm, quiet, and unstoppable. The morning after I opened my father's letter, the air in the farmhouse felt different. It's strange how a place can suddenly feel unfamiliar, even though you've lived in it your whole life. Every wall, every floorboard seemed to whisper something I couldn't quite hear. I sat at the old kitchen table with the envelope spread out in front of me. The map my father had drawn was simple. Rough lines marking the property, a few trees, the barn, the house itself, and a small X near the back garden. He hadn't written any explanation next to it. Just that single letter in his familiar handwriting. The house holds more than memories. I traced my finger along the path from the house to the X. That spot was near the old oak tree, the one my mother had loved. It was massive, its roots twisting deep into the ground like veins. I used to play there as a child, building little fairy houses from twigs and stones, while my father worked in the garden. So after breakfast, I put on my boots, grabbed a small shovel, and went outside. The grass was still wet from the morning dew. The air was cold, sharp enough to make me shiver even through my sweater. The oak stood quiet, just as I remembered. I walked around it slowly, searching for any sign of disturbance. At first, there was nothing unusual, but then I noticed a patch of soil that looked a little different, softer, as if it had been turned over recently. My heart began to beat faster. I started digging. It wasn't easy. The ground was stubborn, the roots thick. But after a few minutes, my shovel hit something solid. I brushed the dirt away with my hands and found a small rusted metal box. My breath caught in my throat. I lifted it out carefully. The lock had corroded over time, but it wasn't strong. I found an old screwdriver in the shed and pried it open. Inside was a bundle of documents tied together with a piece of faded ribbon, and beneath them, a small velvet pouch. I untied the ribbon first. The papers were old company files, contracts, bank statements, and handwritten notes in my father's handwriting. Some had Mark's name on them. I frowned, flipping through the pages. The more I read, the more confused I became. They weren't just old records, they were evidence. There were notes detailing financial discrepancies in the business, missing funds and transactions that didn't add up. One page was particularly detailed, listing dates and amounts, with a line at the bottom that read, "Mark withdrew these funds without authorization." I froze. My father had discovered something. I turned to another page, a letter written but never sent. It was addressed to the company's board of directors. In it, my father had explained that he suspected Mark of embezzling money from the business over several years. He wrote that he was torn between exposing him or giving him a chance to make things right privately. But apparently, Mark never knew. Beneath the documents was the velvet pouch. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a small gold key and a folded piece of paper. The note said, "Safety Deposit Box, Bank of Clearwater, Box 1127. I sat there for a long moment, staring at it all. The proof, the key, the quiet revelation that everything Mark had been bragging about for years was built on lies. For a long time, I didn't move. I didn't feel anger yet, not fully, just a slow realization that my father had known more than he ever said, and that maybe, just maybe, he had left me this house for a reason far greater than sentiment. That evening, I called the lawyer, Mr. Hayes. "Mr. Hayes," I said quietly. "My father mentioned a safety deposit box in his note. Can you help me access it?" There was a pause on the line. "Ah," he said, his tone thoughtful. "Yes, I believe I'm aware of that box. He left instructions that you could access it upon presenting this key. I'll make the arrangements." "Did he tell you what's in it?" I asked. He hesitated. "No, Nora. He only said, when she's ready, she'll know what to do." Those words stuck with me. When she's ready. 2 days later, I found myself sitting in a small private room at the Bank of Clearwater. The clerk handed me the deposit box with polite detachment, as if this wasn't potentially life-changing. I slid the gold key into the lock, turned it, and lifted the lid. Inside was a stack of papers and a small USB drive. The papers were copies of the same financial evidence I'd found in the box under the oak tree. But this time, they were organized neatly, labeled, and signed. There were also letters addressed to the company's board, and a legal affidavit prepared by my father himself, dated a few months before his death. The affidavit was shocking. In it, my father wrote that he had discovered serious fraud committed by Mark, over $2 million embezzled from company accounts through fake vendor payments and shell companies. He had confronted Mark about it privately, and Mark had begged him not to go public, promising to return the money. My father had agreed, but Mark never kept his word. The last paragraph read, "If you are reading this, it means I did not have the strength to expose him myself. My love for my son blinded me for too long, but I cannot leave the company, nor my daughter, to suffer for his greed. These documents speak for themselves. I leaned back in my chair, the air leaving my lungs in a single shaky breath. My father hadn't left me the farmhouse as an afterthought. He had left it as protection, as a place to hide the truth until I was ready to reveal it. The USB drive contained scanned copies of everything, plus one additional file, a video message from my father. I clicked it open on the small laptop the bank provided. The screen flickered, and then there he was, sitting in his study, thinner than I remembered, but with the same calm eyes. "Nora," he began, his voice tired but steady. "If you're watching this, then the time has come. I've left the business to Mark, but not because I trust him. I left it to him because he will reveal himself in time. You've always been the one with the patience and the heart to do what's right. I know it's unfair that you were the one who stayed, the one who sacrificed so much, and still got the least. But I had to protect you. What you hold now is the truth. Use it wisely. Don't act in anger. Act in clarity. Let him destroy himself with his own arrogance. I trust you to know when." The video ended. I sat there staring at the dark screen. My throat felt tight, my eyes stinging. I had spent years thinking I was the overlooked one, the quiet daughter who got the scraps. But now, I realized my father had trusted me more than anyone else. He had counted on my restraint, my patience, the very traits my brother mocked. On the drive home, I thought about what to do next. I could take the documents to the board or to the authorities. I could ruin Mark in an instant, but my father's words echoed in my head. Don't act in anger. Act in clarity. So I waited. For the next few weeks, I went about my life quietly. I fixed small things around the house, went through my father's old journals, and started cataloging the evidence. I also began keeping an eye on Mark. He'd been all over social media lately, flashy posts, interviews, boasting about expanding the business, announcing new partnerships. He seemed unstoppable. Then one afternoon he called me. "Nora," he said, his voice overly cheerful. "I was thinking you should sell the farmhouse. It's a waste of space, and I could help you invest the money properly. You don't know how to handle property anyway." I almost laughed. "I think I'll keep it," I replied. He sighed, annoyed. "Fine, but don't say I didn't offer. Oh, and there's a company dinner next week. I think you should come. It'd be good PR for the family. Maybe then people won't pity you so much." His words were meant to sting. Instead, they only confirmed what I already knew. Mark was drunk on his own power. He saw me as weak, harmless, insignificant. And that was exactly what I needed him to believe. Because revenge, I've learned, isn't about rage or shouting. It's about patience, timing. So, I accepted the invitation. The company dinner would be the first time I'd seen Mark in weeks, and as I prepared for it, I decided it would also be the first quiet step in his undoing. The night of the company dinner arrived cold and clear, the kind of evening that felt too elegant for the tension it carried. I hadn't attended one of Mark's corporate events in years, not since before Dad got sick. Back then, I would watch from a corner table as Mark charmed investors with that same easy smile, while I made polite conversation with whoever happened to sit beside me. Tonight would be different. I stood in front of the farmhouse mirror, adjusting a simple navy blue dress that had belonged to my mother. It wasn't flashy, but it fit well, and it carried a quiet dignity that felt right. As I fastened a silver pendant around my neck, I thought of Dad's voice in that video. Act in clarity. I arrived at the venue, a downtown hotel ballroom lit by chandeliers and full of people who looked like they lived on espresso and ambition. Laughter echoed through the room. Waiters moved smoothly between tables with trays of champagne flutes. It was exactly Mark's scene. Polished, expensive, and full of people who measured worth by how loudly they could be seen. When I stepped inside, heads turned slightly. I could tell by their glances that I wasn't expected. My presence didn't fit into the polished, predictable rhythm of Mark's world. And then, there he was. Mark spotted me across the room and smiled that rehearsed smile of his, the kind that didn't quite reach his eyes. He made his way over, adjusting his cufflinks as he walked, the image of success in motion. Well, look who decided to join the living, he said lightly, kissing me on the cheek as if we were close. I almost thought you'd forgotten how to socialize. I smiled faintly. You invited me, remember? He laughed. True. I'm glad you came, really. You'll get to see what hard work looks like. There it was, that familiar tone, half joking, half cutting. I'd heard it my whole life. He led me to a table near the front, where a few of his board members were seated. Most of them greeted me politely, but their eyes flicked toward Mark for cues on how to treat me. He was their son. I was a faint shadow. Dinner began, and speeches followed. Mark took the stage with his usual confidence, thanking the employees, the board, the partners. He talked about growth, about vision, about the company's future. His voice carried easily across the room, smooth and convincing. If I hadn't known the truth, I might have admired him again. But I did know the truth, and it sat quietly inside me, sharp and still. After the applause, Mark made his way back to the table and leaned close to me. See? Not bad for the kid Dad used to yell at for skipping accounting class, huh? Impressive, I said softly. He chuckled. You should come by the office sometime. Maybe I'll let you see how things are really done. I smiled. Maybe I will. That night, I didn't make any dramatic moves. I didn't confront him or wave the documents in his face. That wasn't the plan. Revenge, I reminded myself, wasn't about confrontation. It was about construction. About building something so inevitable that by the time he realized what was happening, it would already be too late. So I began quietly. Over the next few weeks, I started visiting the company, at first under the pretense of sorting Dad's personal items from his old office. Mark didn't object. In fact, he seemed pleased by what he thought was my submission. Just don't get in anyone's way, he'd said. The office was sleek and modern, full of glass walls and silent efficiency. But beneath that surface, I could sense tension. Employees who avoided eye contact when Mark passed by. Whispers that stopped abruptly in hallways. The kind of unease that blooms in places where leadership has turned into fear. One afternoon, as I sat at Dad's old desk going through some papers, a middle-aged accountant named Susan knocked on the door. She looked hesitant, like she wasn't sure if speaking to me was a good idea. Can I help you? I asked. She closed the door behind her. You don't know me, but I worked closely with your father, she said quietly. He trusted me. Before he passed, he asked me to keep some records safe, in case they were ever needed. My pulse quickened. What kind of records? She opened a folder she was holding and set it on the desk. Inside were spreadsheets, emails, and printouts that matched the pattern I'd seen in the hidden documents at the farmhouse. Transactions that pointed to Mark's financial misconduct. I looked up at her. Why are you showing me this? She sighed. Because I've seen things get worse since he took over. He's been moving money again. Same methods, different accounts. I can't prove it fully, but it's happening. I don't know what to do anymore. Her voice trembled slightly. The kind of tremor that comes from fear mixed with conscience. I nodded slowly. You did the right thing coming to me. Keep this quiet for now. I'll handle it. She looked relieved and terrified at once. If he finds out, he won't, I interrupted softly. Not yet. When she left, I stared at the papers, feeling a familiar weight settle in my chest. My father had left me the truth. Now that truth was growing, spreading, collecting witnesses. That night, I sat at the farmhouse kitchen table again, the documents spread out in front of me under the dim light. Outside, rain drummed softly against the windows. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. Mark wasn't just a selfish man who'd stolen from our father's company once. He was doing it again, more boldly this time, and the board, too intimidated or complacent, had turned a blind eye. I needed to be careful. One wrong move and he'd bury everything before I could act. So I decided to make him comfortable. To let him think I was harmless. The next week, I brought him coffee at the office and congratulated him on a new contract. I asked about his work, listened, laughed at his stories. I made him believe I was finally accepting his version of reality, where he was the successful brother and I was the simple one. And it worked. His guard began to lower. He started inviting me to meetings, introducing me to his business partners as my sister who's learning the ropes. I took mental notes of everything: names, dates, figures, contracts. I asked gentle questions, pretending curiosity when I was actually mapping out his web of deceit. One afternoon, while waiting in his office, I noticed a document partially tucked under a folder on his desk. It was a draft of a new agreement with a foreign supplier, but something about it didn't add up. The supplier's address matched one of the fake entities mentioned in Dad's old notes. My father had called it Martech Solutions, a shell company Mark had once used to funnel funds. I quietly snapped a photo of the document with my phone before he returned. That night, I cross-checked the information. It matched perfectly. He was using the same trick again, just bolder. I spent hours creating a detailed timeline: dates, transactions, fake accounts, transfers. Piece by piece, I built a case so airtight that even Mark's charm couldn't talk his way out of it. But I wasn't ready to expose him yet, because I wanted him to fall not just publicly, but personally. I wanted him to realize that everything he'd mocked me for, my quietness, my patience, my supposed weakness, was the very thing that would undo him. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. A month later, Mark hosted another company event, a press conference announcing a major expansion deal. He invited local media, investors, and even city officials. It was his moment of triumph, and he made sure everyone knew it. "Nora," he said that morning over the phone, "come by the event tonight. You'll want to see what success looks like." I agreed. Before leaving, I called Mr. Hayes, the lawyer, and Susan, the accountant. We arranged to meet afterward. I had all the documents copied and sealed in a folder. That evening, I arrived early and watched from the back as Mark took the stage again, speaking confidently about growth, innovation, legacy. The audience applauded every word. Cameras flashed. And then, as he wrapped up, a journalist raised a hand. "Mr. Thompson, there have been some online discussions about financial irregularities in your overseas partnerships. Would you like to comment on that?" The room shifted. Mark laughed lightly, brushing it off. "Baseless rumors," he said. "People love to talk when you're successful." But behind him, on the projector screen, something changed. The next slide, which was supposed to display the company's new slogan, instead flashed a different image, one that froze him mid-sentence. It was a spreadsheet, a transaction log. With his name on it, gasps rippled through the room. Whispers rose like static. Mark turned, stunned. "What the— who—" The screen flipped again, to another document, and another, each one a clear link between him and fraudulent accounts. The audience was no longer clapping. Cameras were recording. Board members exchanged alarmed glances. Mark's voice broke through the chaos. "This isn't real. This is some kind of—" But the damage was done. I didn't stay to watch the rest. I slipped out quietly through a side door, my heart steady, my steps calm. In the parking lot, I looked up at the city lights and exhaled slowly. I hadn't hacked the presentation. I didn't need to. I'd simply given the right information to the right person, someone on the board who had grown tired of Mark's arrogance. Someone ready to protect the company before it collapsed under him. By the time I reached home, my phone was buzzing with messages from reporters, employees, even distant relatives. Mark's downfall had begun quietly, methodically, and it was only the beginning. Because what he didn't know yet was that the legal investigation was already underway, and I was just getting started. I didn't know what I expected to feel when the truth came out. Relief, maybe. Vindication, possibly. But mostly I felt quiet, like the storm that had been brewing in my chest for months had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind still air and a clear horizon. Yet I knew this wasn't the end. The truth about the will was only part of the story. There were still wounds that hadn't healed, debts of respect that hadn't been paid, and lessons that needed to be learned. After the day at the lawyer's office, I stayed at the farmhouse for weeks. My brother Michael barely reached out. The few times he did, his messages were short, stiff, and written in the tone of someone trying to pretend everything was normal. I ignored most of them. I needed time to think, time to grieve, and time to rediscover what home meant now that it wasn't just a symbol of disappointment. Every day, I found something new about the house that connected me back to my father. A hidden drawer in his old writing desk with a few dried-up pens and an old photograph of us fishing at the lake. A dusty box in the attic filled with letters he'd never sent, notes to friends, to Mom, even to Michael and me. Some of them were half-finished, like thoughts he never got to complete. Reading through those letters broke something inside me, but in a gentle way. In one of them, written just a few months before he passed, he wrote, "If one day they both come to hate me, at least Nora will understand why I did it this way." At first, I didn't know what he meant. But slowly, as I pieced together more clues, I realized my father had left everything exactly as he wanted. Not to punish me, and not to reward Michael blindly, but to test what we valued most. The farmhouse, as I'd learned, wasn't just a piece of land. It was tied to something much larger, the history of our family. My great-grandfather had built it, and over the generations, parts of the property had been sold, but a few acres still remained in our name. Those acres had mineral rights, something I only discovered after digging through old documents left in Dad's study. When I read the papers, my hands shook. It took me several rereads to understand what it meant. Under that neglected land, there were oil reserves. My father must have known. The lawyer must have known too. That's why he said my inheritance wasn't what it seemed. I could almost hear my father's voice in my head. You can't judge worth by the dust on the surface. Still, I didn't rush to act. Part of me didn't want to turn it into a competition again. My brother had always measured life by numbers. Profits, losses, accounts, deals. I didn't want to become like him. I wanted to do things differently, to honor what my father had built, not strip it down for revenge. But fate has a funny way of nudging you when you least expect it. One chilly morning, as I was making coffee, I got a call from the law firm again. The same lawyer, Mr. Whitaker, asked me to come by. He said there was an additional matter regarding the estate. I didn't think much of it, but when I arrived, Michael was already there, pacing in the waiting area like a restless animal. He looked different, thinner, more tired. The confidence he'd always carried like armor seemed to have cracked. When he saw me, he gave a half smile. "Guess we're both regulars here now," he muttered. I didn't reply. Mr. Whitaker led us into his office. He closed the door gently and motioned for us to sit. "I'll get straight to it," he said. "Your father included a clause in his will that only takes effect 6 months after his passing." Michael frowned. "A clause? What kind of clause?" The lawyer adjusted his glasses and continued. "It concerns the ownership of the business and the property. According to your father's instructions, both inheritances were conditional." I felt my stomach tighten. Michael leaned forward, his voice sharp. "Conditional? You mean I could lose the business?" "Yes," the lawyer said calmly. "Your father required both of you to maintain your respective inheritances responsibly. In your case, Mr. Parker," he looked directly at Michael, "you were to ensure the business remained debt-free and ethically managed for 6 months following his death. If there was any evidence of misconduct or financial manipulation, the ownership would be automatically transferred to your sister." Michael froze. I could hear the faint ticking of the wall clock as silence filled the room. Mr. Whitaker then turned to me. "And Miss Nora, your condition was to maintain residence at the farmhouse and not attempt to sell or mortgage it during the same period. You fulfilled that." I blinked, trying to process his words. "So what happens now?" The lawyer sighed and opened a folder. "Unfortunately, there were issues discovered during a recent audit. Your father's accountant reported irregularities in the company's financials. Funds were moved from business accounts to personal investments, and certain assets were liquidated without proper authorization." Michael's face drained of color. "That's ridiculous." The lawyer raised a hand. We have documentation, Mr. Parker. I'm afraid the terms of the clause have been breached. The business, effective immediately, reverts to Nora Parker. The room fell dead silent. My brother sat frozen, staring at the lawyer like he'd just spoken another language. I didn't move either. I couldn't. Michael finally found his voice. You're telling me I lose everything because of a technicality? It's not a technicality, the lawyer replied evenly. It's the will of your father. I sat there, feeling both numb and strangely detached, as if I was watching a scene play out in someone else's life. My brother's arrogance, his mockery, his dismissal of me, all of it seemed so small now. When we left the office, the air outside felt heavier. Michael followed me to the parking lot, his voice cracking with anger. You planned this, didn't you?
You and Dad, you set me up!
I turned to face him. No, Michael, you set yourself up. You thought you could do whatever you wanted without consequences. Dad just gave you enough rope to see how far you'd go. He glared at me, his eyes full of resentment, then got into his car and sped off. That evening, I drove back to the farmhouse in silence. My phone buzzed constantly. Messages from lawyers, from the company's staff, even from the local newspaper who'd heard about the ownership change. I ignored them all. I wasn't ready to face that world yet. I sat on the porch, watching the sky fade from gold to deep blue, and thought about my father. I realized finally what his test had been about. It wasn't about who could handle wealth better, or who deserved more. It was about who could hold on to what mattered when everything else fell away. But even as peace began to settle in, I knew things weren't over. The business might have been mine now, but that didn't mean it was in good shape. My brother's mismanagement had left debts and distrust in its wake. If I wanted to truly honor my father's legacy and show Michael that integrity mattered more than greed, I'd have to rebuild it from the ground up. And I would. For once, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel overlooked. I felt capable. Like everything I had endured, every insult, every lonely night, had been leading to this moment. As I locked up the farmhouse that night, I whispered softly to the dark. Thank you, Dad, I understand now. But even as I said it, I knew that the real revenge wasn't in taking over what Michael had lost. It was in proving that I could build something lasting from what he had destroyed. And that was exactly what I planned to do next. When I woke up the next morning, the air in the farmhouse felt different. Lighter somehow, but not entirely peaceful. It was as if the weight of the past few months had shifted. Not gone, just moved into a new corner of my life, waiting for me to decide what to do with it. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, staring at my phone as message after message poured in. The company's board wanted an emergency meeting. Some employees were threatening to quit. The accountant had sent over files marked urgent. And then there was Michael, his name flashing on the screen over and over again. I didn't answer him. Not yet. I wasn't ready to face the storm he was bound to unleash. Instead, I took a slow breath, opened my father's old notebook, the one I'd found in his desk, and reread a line I had underlined days ago. You cannot fix what you do not understand. That would be my starting point. By noon, I was driving into the city, the same city where I had spent so many weekends sitting in the corner of Dad's office, watching him talk to his employees as if they were family. Back then, I never understood why he gave so much of his time and patience to the people working for him. Now I did. They had helped him build everything. And now they would need to help me rebuild it. When I entered the company building, I could feel the shift immediately. The receptionist, who had known me since I was a teenager, gave a cautious smile, but avoided direct eye contact. A few people whispered as I walked past. News travels fast, especially when it involves money and power. Inside the conference room, the entire board was waiting, a mix of familiar and unfamiliar faces. Some I remembered from the old days when Dad ran things with integrity and calm authority. Others were newer, men and women my brother had brought in during his short but chaotic reign. As I took my seat at the head of the table, the tension was thick enough to taste. The CFO, a stern man named Grant, spoke first. Ms. Parker, congratulations, I suppose, are in order, although I must say this entire situation is highly unusual. His tone made it clear he didn't think much of me. I met his eyes and replied evenly. So was the way my brother handled company funds. That earned me a few raised eyebrows. Another board member, a woman named Claire who had worked with my father for over 15 years, nodded slightly in approval. Your father always said you had his calmness, she murmured. I smiled faintly. I'll need it. The meeting was long and uncomfortable. I listened more than I spoke, taking notes and trying to understand where things stood. The business was bleeding. Not enough to collapse immediately, but bad enough that a few wrong moves could send it spiraling. My brother had borrowed against company assets to fund risky side ventures, real estate, tech startups, even a luxury car dealership. Most of those ventures were in debt. When the meeting finally ended, Grant stayed behind. You're in over your head, Nora, he said bluntly. This isn't a family hobby. It's a multi-million-dollar operation. Maybe it's best if you step aside and let professionals handle this. I looked at him for a long moment. My father built this company from nothing. He didn't have a business degree, or fancy investors, or people telling him to step aside. He had common sense, patience, and integrity. I have those too. That'll be enough for now. Grant exhaled, half amused, half exasperated. We'll see how long that lasts. Then he walked out. After he left, I sat alone in the conference room, the silence pressing in. It would have been easy to give up right there, to sell the company, take whatever profits I could, and retreat back to the peace of the farmhouse. But something deep inside me refused. Maybe it was pride, or maybe it was the voice of my father reminding me that giving up wasn't an option. That night, I drove back to the farmhouse and stood in front of the old fireplace, staring at the worn stone mantel. I could almost imagine my father sitting in his armchair, looking at me with that quiet half-smile of his. You'll figure it out, kiddo, he'd probably say. Just take one thing at a time. So I did. The next few weeks were a blur of meetings, audits, and long nights reading through financial statements I barely understood at first. I learned as I went, from accountants, advisors, even old employees who had stayed loyal to my father's memory. I asked questions without shame, took notes, and slowly, I started seeing patterns. My brother hadn't just mismanaged money. He'd betrayed people's trust. He'd cut salaries, laid off workers without notice, and pocketed bonuses that were supposed to go to the staff. When that realization hit me, I felt something sharp inside. Not anger exactly, but a cold resolve. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about restoring something that had been broken. One morning, I called a meeting with the senior staff and told them my plan. We're going to make things right, I said. Every person who was unfairly laid off will be contacted. Anyone who was denied a bonus will get it, once we stabilize the cash flow. And moving forward, transparency will be the rule, not the exception. Some of them looked skeptical, others hopeful. Claire smiled. Your father would be proud, she said quietly. Slowly, word began to spread, not just about the company's change in leadership, but about the way things were shifting. Employees started to trust me. A few investors who had pulled out came back, cautiously at first. Meanwhile, my brother tried to reach out several times. His messages varied between anger, guilt, and desperation. I ignored most of them until one day, curiosity got the better of me. I finally picked up his call. Nora, he said, his voice tired and shaky. You've made your point. You won. Can we talk? I hesitated. About what, Michael? He sighed heavily. About Dad, about everything. I can't sleep. I can't stop thinking about how it all went wrong. There was something in his tone, not manipulation this time, but genuine exhaustion. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet him. We met at a small cafe halfway between the city and the farmhouse. He looked nothing like the confident, arrogant man I used to know. His clothes were wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot, and his hands wouldn't stop fidgeting. I lost everything, he said quietly, staring into his coffee. The cars, the house, the accounts had all gone. I thought I was smarter than Dad. I thought money meant I was winning. He gave a hollow laugh. Turns out I was wrong. I watched him silently. A part of me wanted to feel sorry for him, but another part remembered all the times he'd mocked me, dismissed me, and twisted the knife deeper when I was at my lowest. Dad didn't do this to punish you, I finally said. He wanted to teach you something. Both of us, really. You just didn't listen. He nodded slowly. Yeah, I see that now. Then he looked up at me, eyes glassy. Are you happy now, Nora? You got what you wanted. I thought about that for a long moment. No, Michael, I didn't want you to lose everything. I wanted you to understand what everything means. He didn't respond. He just sat there, shoulders slumped, like a man finally realizing the weight of his own actions. When I left the cafe, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt settled, peaceful even. The revenge, if you could call it that, had already happened. Not because I'd taken something from him, but because he'd finally seen what he'd thrown away. Over the next few months, the business began to thrive again. We introduced new ethical policies, reopened departments my brother had shut down, and hired back several loyal employees. Investors began to notice the turnaround. The company wasn't just surviving, it was regaining its soul. Sometimes, I'd get calls from Michael. He was working small jobs here and there, trying to rebuild. I didn't cut him off. I answered sometimes, offering polite words but keeping a distance. Maybe one day we'd have a normal relationship again, maybe not. But I didn't need that closure anymore. One evening, as I locked up the office, I stood by the window and looked out at the city lights. I thought about the journey, from the lonely days caring for Dad, to the humiliation of being mocked, to this quiet moment of stability. It struck me then. Revenge doesn't always have to be loud. Sometimes it's just the calm satisfaction of knowing you rose above what tried to break you, and built something better in its place. And for the first time in a long while, I smiled. The following year moved slowly, but with a quiet rhythm that felt almost healing. The company had steadied, the employees trusted me, and the farmhouse had become more than an inheritance. It was my refuge. There were mornings I'd wake to the smell of fresh rain on the fields, walk barefoot across the damp grass, and feel something I hadn't felt in years: contentment. It wasn't happiness exactly. It was something deeper, the kind of peace that comes only after you've lived through chaos and learned to breathe again. The business was thriving. Not because of me alone, but because I'd chosen to rebuild it with integrity, the same way my father had once done. We reopened departments that my brother had shut down, created fairer contracts, and restored trust with our clients. The employees who had once looked at me with doubt now greeted me with quiet respect. I still went to the office 3 days a week, but the farmhouse was my home. It grounded me. Every evening when I returned, I'd sit by the window in my father's old chair, reading the notes he'd left behind. Sometimes I'd speak aloud, as if he were still there. "You were right, Dad," I'd say softly. "You really did know both of us better than we knew ourselves." One night, as I was reorganizing a cabinet, I found a sealed envelope tucked behind an old ledger. My heart skipped a beat when I saw my name written in my father's handwriting. It was dated just 2 weeks before he died. For a long while I just held it, afraid to open it, afraid of what emotions it might stir after everything that had already happened. Finally, I sat down by the fireplace and unfolded the letter. "My dearest Nora, if you are reading this, it means the plan worked, or at least I hope it did. I know what I did must have felt unfair at first, maybe even cruel, but I trust that time will show you the truth. I gave Michael what he thought he wanted, and you what I knew you needed. He always chased success. You always carried love. The world often confuses the two, but they are not the same. The farmhouse may look like a burden, but it is your strength. It will remind you that worth isn't measured in money, but in roots, in patience, in the things that last. As for the company, it was never meant to divide you both. It was meant to reveal you. If by now you hold it in your hands, it means you've proven something greater than ambition. You've proven heart. Don't hate your brother, Nora. He is lost, but he is not beyond redemption. Give him time. Pain is a stern teacher, but sometimes it's the only one that reaches us. I am proud of you, my girl. Take care of what I built, and but more importantly, take care of who you are. Love always, Dad. By the time I finished reading, my eyes were full of tears. I pressed the letter to my chest, feeling an ache of gratitude and sorrow all at once. It wasn't just a goodbye. It was his final lesson. That night, I sat outside under the stars, listening to the soft hum of crickets, and thought about everything he'd written. He had seen through both of us so clearly. He knew that giving Michael wealth would test his integrity, and giving me something humble would test my resilience. In his own quiet way, he had guided both of us, even from beyond the grave. A week later, I decided to visit Michael. It had been months since our last conversation, and part of me still felt uneasy about leaving things unfinished. I found him living in a small apartment above an auto garage on the edge of town. When he opened the door, he looked startled to see me. "Nora," he said, rubbing the back of his neck awkwardly. "Didn't expect you." "I won't stay long," I said gently. "I just wanted to check in." The place was cluttered but clean. A coffee mug sat beside a stack of bills. There were no luxury cars, no expensive furniture, just the basics. For a man who once thrived on power and wealth, this simplicity looked strange on him. He gestured for me to sit. "Things are different," he said quietly. "I'm working as a mechanic for now, trying to pay off what's left of the debt. It's not much, but I guess it's honest work." I nodded. "That's good, Michael." He stared at his hands. "You know, I used to laugh at you for staying in that old house. I thought you'd thrown your life away. Turns out you were the one who got it right." There was no bitterness in his tone this time, just exhaustion and honesty. I pulled out the letter and placed it on the table. "Dad left this for me. You should read it." He hesitated, then took it. As his eyes moved across the page, I saw something shift in his expression. First confusion, then guilt, then a quiet kind of peace. When he finished, he folded the letter carefully, his voice breaking. "He knew everything, didn't he?" "Yes," I said softly. "He always did." For a long time, we just sat there. Two siblings who had spent years competing for a man's love, finally realizing we'd both had it all along. When I left that day, Michael walked me to my car. Before I got in, he said thank you for not giving up on me completely. I smiled faintly. Dad wouldn't have wanted me to. As I drove back to the farmhouse, I felt something lift from my shoulders. Not just forgiveness, but closure. The kind that doesn't come from revenge, but from understanding. Months passed, and life slowly found its rhythm again. Michael and I began speaking occasionally, short calls at first, then longer ones. He never asked for the business back. Instead, he offered ideas on how to modernize some of the operations. For once, it felt like we were on the same side. The company continued to grow. We expanded into new regions, launched sustainable initiatives, and partnered with local communities. I hired people who shared my father's values, people who believed that success meant more than profit. And through it all, the farmhouse remained my anchor. It was where I found clarity when decisions felt heavy, where I celebrated small victories, and where I kept my father's photo above the mantel, his smile watching over me. One summer afternoon, as I was sitting on the porch reading, I heard a car pull up. It was Michael. He stepped out, dressed in clean overalls, his face tanned and calm. He looked healthier, more grounded. "I thought I'd come see the place," he said with a shy grin. "Haven't been here since the funeral." I nodded and gestured for him to sit beside me. "It's changed a bit, but it still feels like home." He looked around, taking in the fields, the old oak tree, the distant hills. "I used to hate this house," he admitted. "Now I get why Dad loved it." We sat in silence for a while. Then, he turned to me and said, "You know, I think Dad was teaching us the same lesson, just in different ways." I smiled. He was. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange. For the first time in years, it felt like the world was in balance again. As the day faded, I realized something. Revenge had never truly been my goal. Justice, yes. Peace, definitely. But revenge? That had burned out the moment I stopped needing my brother to fail in order to feel whole. My victory wasn't in taking what he lost. It was in becoming who I was meant to be, strong, patient, and unshakably calm. Later that evening, after Michael left, I stood alone by the window, watching the lights from the barn flicker in the distance. I whispered softly, "You can rest easy now. Dad, we're both okay." The wind outside rustled through the trees, and for just a moment, it felt like an answer. And that was it, the quiet end to a long storm. Not with shouting or triumph, but with peace. Because sometimes, the sweetest revenge isn't destroying the one who hurt you. It's rebuilding yourself so completely that their actions no longer define you. I closed my father's letter one last time, placed it back in the drawer, and smiled. Life, I realized, doesn't always give us what we want, but if we stay patient, it gives us exactly what we need. And as I turned off the lights, the farmhouse glowed softly behind me, a symbol not of loss anymore, but of quiet strength. So if you're listening to this, remember, revenge doesn't always need to be loud or cruel. Sometimes it's as calm as forgiveness, as steady as growth, and as gentle as peace. This was my story, a story of inheritance, betrayal, and quiet redemption. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my Calm Revenge for more stories like this. Stories where silence speaks louder than anger, and calm is the sharpest form of revenge.